April 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his own life when the arrival of the Red Army at the gates of Berlin was imminent. During these same days, a charming SS guard who worked in a camp known as the Beautiful Specter managed to escape and hide from the Soviets. She was Jenny-Wanda Barkmann, a Nazi guard who stood out for three things: her undisguised beauty, her inexhaustible cruelty, and her fanaticism for the Nazi cause. National Socialism had turned that angel into a true sadistic demon who enjoyed perpetrating the worst crimes of humankind. 1 month later, she was captured and, a year later, judged for everything she had done during her stay in the Stutthof concentration camp in Poland and brutally executed. How she became from being the advertising model she wished as a young girl to a fierce war criminal, this is the story of Jenny-Wanda Barkmann and her horrific ending. The dream of becoming a model during Nazism. Jenny-Wanda Barkmann was born into a low-income family in the city of Hamburg on May 30th, 1922. These were times in which Hitler had already become a captivating speaker in the taverns of Bavaria. His ability to deliver grandiloquent speeches to a drunken and furious audience about Germany's economic and political situation soon earned him recognition within the far-right groups that were forming in Weimar Germany. In those early years of the 1920s, Jenny was just a child, and the Nazi ideology was still far away from her life and her family environment. While Adolf Hitler was writing his lines in prison and shaping his Mein Kampf, Jenny was just taking her first steps. She was learning to walk, to ride a bicycle, and soon to play with dolls. She had only few toys and clothes. Her family was humble and was suffering the consequences of the post-war economic crisis in Germany. It was not easy to be a child in these times of crisis in Germany. It was even less easy to be a girl. However, in Weimar German society, despite the economic difficulties and in comparison to other more conservative European societies, there was a liberating boom at the cultural level that put women in a somewhat better status than in the times of Imperial Germany. This kind of liberalization of behavioral patterns turned women into an object of consumption, but also an incipient consumer subject. It is in this context that careers such as acting and modeling in Weimar Republic Germany began to be seen as a viable career for working-class women who wanted to move up the social ladder. Jenny was just a teenager when the idea of becoming a model crossed her mind and, at first, she had the reluctance of her family. Soon her parents realized that this could become a way for their beloved Jenny to get out of poverty and even help her family cope with the crisis by economically exploiting that beauty that was beginning to show in her physical development. Little Barkmann was only 11 years old when Hitler came to power in 1933 and became Chancellor of a Germany that was still suffering from the economic crisis and was beginning to go through a period of violence in the streets, encouraged by the vigilante gangs that acted with almost total impunity. It is possible that Jenny, at the age of 11 and about to turn 12 with Hitler in power, knew little of the political situation her country was going through, but she would begin to notice that her dream of being a model was beginning to be frowned upon by a government that was beginning to take a dim view of the process of incipient liberalization that women had undergone during the Weimar Republic. Throughout her adolescence, Jenny witnessed how the Gestapo began to persecute Jews who were her neighbors in Hamburg, how Goebbels ordered Germans not to buy in Jewish businesses. She began to observe how this violence grew and grew in the streets of her beloved city, and how her dream of being a model began to be frustrated in a context of increasing control of sexual behavior and bodies by the Nazis. It is worth noting that adolescent sexual activity was something very important to control for the Nazis. On the one hand, we can affirm that they were quite puritanical and that they wanted to extirpate the supposed moral decadence to which the Weimar Social Democrats had led Germany, and on the other hand, they promoted a certain promiscuity among adolescents so that the new Aryans would reproduce and thus populate Germany and the rest of the countries they intended to conquer. In this confusing context of, on the one hand, repression and on the other, incentive to promiscuity, Jenny began to explore her body, her sex, and to know pleasure. A pleasure that she would soon find in her life not by modeling or having sex, but by brutally torturing prisoners, victims of the Holocaust. Nazism enters in Jenny's heart and changes her life. Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, an event that started World War II. The world was changed forever, and many citizens of Western Europe were shocked by the news. However, most Germans had been preparing for this war for some time. Some years earlier, at least since the mid-1930s, Germany had begun to emerge from the economic crisis into which the Treaty of Versailles had plunged it, and which the Weimar Republic had failed to resolve. One main factor in Germany's economic recovery was to put the workers into production for the rearmament of Germany, thus violating one of the most controversial points of the Versailles Treaty, which prohibited Germany from rebuilding its armed forces. While the Germans regained their jobs and began to enjoy a certain economic stability, Goebbels mounted an enormous propaganda apparatus in order to spread Nazi doctrine throughout Germany and convince its entire citizenry to embark on a war adventure that would bring glory to the Aryan race and restore Germany to greatness. For this mission, Goebbels used cinema, graphics, propaganda at all levels, sports, arts, and also the school. It was in this context that Jenny was educated. Through advertising, through film, and through school, Jenny became more and more convinced that the Führer's message was the right one and that she should follow it no matter what the consequences. When Hitler invaded Poland, Jenny was only 17 years old. She was already a convinced fan of the Führer's message by that time, and those who had known her since she was a child began to see changes in her personality. Little by little, Jenny abandoned the idea of becoming a German supermodel. It should be noted that in their admiration for Olympic art and sport, and both Greek and Roman culture, the Nazis paid special attention to encourage exercise among young people and to establish and value the Western canons of beauty. Indeed, Goebbels and company understood the importance of cultivating both sexual promiscuity and body worship among the young. That is why modeling and acting in Nazi Germany was not frowned upon by society or the government, despite the conservative values that Hitler and his followers held. Many women succeeded because of their beauty in film and art, such as actresses Irina von Meyendorff and Christina Söderbaum, among others. Jenny may have wanted to take advantage of her beauty in this context and wished to be like those attractive Nazi movie superstars. However, Jenny realized that her contribution to the Aryan cause had to be more direct. At the age of 21, Jenny finally decided to abandon her dreams of becoming a model and actress and enlist in the SS, eventually becoming a concentration camp guard. It was in this role that Jenny Barkmann finally discovered her darkest and most sadistic side, unleashing all the evil and cruelty that lived in her heart. Jenny responds to the Führer's call, from model to SS guard. Jenny-Wanda Barkmann became a female concentration camp guard in 1944. At a time when Hitler was beginning to retreat on the Eastern Front, yet more and more people kept arriving at the concentration camps. This frustrated supermodel, who was a Nazi princess, enlisted in the SS under Heinrich Himmler to satiate her sadistic appetite and to feel that she was fulfilling more directly the mission that the Führer had entrusted to the brave young Germans in a time that was becoming increasingly difficult and that needed the workforce of these convinced young men in all aspects. In general, the women who answered the call of the SS were like Jenny, of humble social origin, who sought a job that required little qualification, was well paid, and also meant an enormous show of loyalty towards the Führer. On the other hand, it could also mean a possibility of social advancement for Jenny, as well as for the rest of the female guards who perform their task efficiently and, above all, loyally. Joseph Goebbels had proposed that the call for women to become concentration camp guards should be published in the newspapers. Young, humble women like Jenny would open the local newspaper and find messages like, "Show your love for the Führer, enlist in the SS Gefolge." The SS Gefolge was nothing more and nothing less than Heinrich Himmler's civilian women's branch of the SS, which was responsible for bureaucratic tasks, cleaning or tidying up. By 1942, these functions were extended, and women of strong character and impetus also began to be recruited to act as guards in war prisons and concentration camps. It was from 1942 onwards that women began to arrive in the concentration camps to work as guards. In German, they were known as Aufseherin. The first women arrived at Auschwitz and Majdanek. There were women in the concentration camps as early as 1941, when some of them began to work in makeshift brothels. But it is only since 1942 that we can observe women who were not sex slaves, but bloodthirsty camp guards. Other women began to arrive as guards, first to Kaiserwald-Riga and Wörth in 1943, and then to the Mauthausen camps, to Bolzano in 1944. But the concentration camp that interests us in this episode is Stutthof, because there, from 1942, women began to arrive as guards. Jenny-Wanda Barkmann was assigned there in 1944, only 1 year before the fall of Nazi Germany. But 1 year was enough for her to unleash her bestiality. The archives claim that among the 50,000 guards who worked in Nazi concentration camps, at least 3,500 were women. Other historians are much more cautious with the figure and maintain that there were no less than 200 women. Whether it was 3,500 or 200, there is no doubt that none of them committed as many atrocities as Jenny-Wanda Barkmann. The atrocities of the beautiful specter. The Stutthof concentration camp was established shortly after Hitler invaded Poland and operated until 1945, when it was liberated by the Red Army. Inside these walls of hell lived about 100,000 people. Political prisoners, homosexuals, Polish dissidents, communists, and above all, many Jews were victims of one of the concentration camps where the greatest cruelties were experienced. Jenny arrived at Stutthof in 1944 at the age of 21. Soon guards and prisoners alike were captivated by her charms. Not for nothing had she tried her hand at modeling in her former life, but that Jenny was dead. In 1944, she had become a Nazi fanatic who thirsted for the blood of Jewish and communist prisoners, women, men, or even children. It was her two faces. On the one hand, she looked like an angel fallen from heaven, and on the other, her heart was full of evil. It is also true that she smiled and enjoyed very much when she saw her victims writhing in pain. Her atrocities and her beauty earned her the nickname, the Beautiful Spectre. This ruthless guard enjoyed beating to death her victims, who were generally both adult and teenage women. Some witnesses claim to have seen her beating even children and mothers with their newborns. Jenny not only liked to torture those in her charge, she not only enjoyed watching them bleed and beg for mercy on the floor while she grinned from ear to ear. Jenny also liked to select herself in person the women and children who would be destined for the gas chamber. This Nazi princess would ask her superiors to let her choose the people who would be destined for this horrible end. She enjoyed seeing their faces, their tears, their gestures of pain. This horrible, clear-eyed Nazi monster laughed as she watched children torn from the weak arms of their mothers to be taken to the gas chamber by her hand. One of her favorite methods of torture was to beat her prisoners with a leather belt that she would take out of her clothes in front of her prisoners and beat them until they bled. It is said that more than 10 women were killed by Jenny after being beaten with a leather belt. Jenny would ask the rest of the women to witness and watch her do it. Being seen at her moment of greatest sadistic pleasure generated satisfaction for her. Seeing the faces of fear and panic in front of her generated an enormous sense of omnipotence. The beautiful spectre thought that in this way the stories about his actions would surely reach Himmler's ears soon, and if it reached Himmler's ears, it was likely that none other than the Führer would also hear about it. Her fierceness had a political goal besides the pure sadistic pleasure, and that was to become the most fearsome Nazi female guard, to receive a medal at some point from none other than her beloved and platonic Adolf Hitler. Some researchers claim that the brutality of his actions as a Nazi guard can be explained by the abandonment he suffered from his parents. The truth is that there is not enough evidence to confirm this, but it would not be at all far-fetched to relate this possible traumatic event with the enjoyment he derived from separating children from their mothers and sending them to the gas chamber. But Jenny not only enjoyed sending children to the gas chamber or beating women with leather belts, she also had other favorite methods of violence and torture. One of her favorite tools were rubber sticks that she used especially for beating all kinds of prisoners. Another hobby of the fearsome Stutthof guard was to take daily walks along the camp with wild dogs, which she left for days without food. When she suddenly saw a mother with a child, she did not hesitate and threw the hungry dogs at them. She couldn't bear to see mothers spending time with their children even in this kind of hellish situation. But Jenny did this with all kinds of prisoners. She enjoyed watching the hungry dogs pounce on the weakened bodies of those prisoners forced to work day and night. Some would die being torn to pieces by their canines, others would be mortally wounded, and Jenny would send them to the medic block to cure them and then turn the dogs loose to hurt them again. Thus, for many of these prisoners, this pastime of Jenny's became a circle of hell. Poison candies and human experiments. this young German girl of lower class, was 23 years old in Stutthof when she slowly became one of the most important and renowned guards during the last years of Nazi Germany. The beautiful specter thus became a true legend that terrorized women, men, and children in Stutthof. This was due not only to the brutal tortures to which she subjected her victims, but also to other issues she had learned at the time she became a fervent Nazi fanatic. Jenny enjoyed something that the dreaded Dr. Josef Mengele also enjoyed. One of her favorite pastimes, besides walking hungry dogs through the camp, was to collect sweets from the kitchen and wrap them with poisonous substances she collected from the medical barracks. At times, Jenny could hide very well her inner evil and intrinsic to her being. She could hide it thanks to her angelic face. This helped her to always get what she wanted. Not only did it help her to win the hearts of the guards, not only would it help her to one day win the heart of the Führer himself, but it also helped her to make the children of Stutthof feel admiration for her and, many times, even affection for her. She would approach the children she saw as healthy, but without a mother or father to look after them, with her characteristic angelic smile, offering to play with them. If they accepted to play with her, she would give those poor children a poisoned candy. The children's faces when they received the gift from the dreaded beautiful specter were touching. Touching for any human being, except for this heartless Nazi beast. These innocent children would return to the blocks with the rest of their mates and tell them that they had played with Jenny and received candy from her. Many of them would look at them in horror because they had already been victims of the sadism of the brutal guard. It was at that moment, or perhaps sometime later, that the children began to feel sick from the poison they had ingested, and many of them were taken away by the hand of Jenny herself to be sent to the gas chamber. Other children were a little luckier and were taken by other guards to the infirmary to be treated, cured, fed, and put back to work in the concentration camp. Another horrors committed by the beautiful specter had to do with an action very typical of Nazi concentration camps, and this was medical and scientific experimentation on prisoners. Jenny had heard the stories coming from other concentration camps and insisted that Stutthof also be a place of experiments, in order to obtain some original scientific development that would reach the ears of Adolf Hitler himself. For this purpose, Jenny convinced local doctors to attend the Stutthof concentration camp and encouraged them to conduct medical experiments of all kinds. Her idea was that they could develop vaccines, cures against diseases, and any other crazy or not crazy ideas that these Nazi fanatic doctors might have. To this end, he made available the women and children he had under his surveillance. The beautiful specter is captured. Unfortunately for this ruthless Nazi princess, her moment of glory as one of the most famous concentration camp guards was short-lived. It lasted just 1 year. In April 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his own life, and only a month later the Soviets entered the city of Danzig, where the Stutthof concentration camp was housed to liberate those poor victims who had suffered the worst crimes against humanity and had been subjected to Jenny-Wanda Barkmann's basest pleasures. This aspiring model turned SS guard was really smart. She soon realized that her end was near if she was captured by the Soviets. When she heard of the arrival of the Red Army in Danzig, she packed her bags and left alone for the neighboring city of Gdansk in Poland. She traveled more than 30 kilometers, possibly on foot, trying to escape the fate that awaited her. While waiting for a train to take her away, the beautiful specter was recognized and stopped. Danzig and Gdansk had soon fallen under Soviet control. Many other guardsmen had managed to escape from Poland, but other guardsmen like Jenny chose to flee inside Poland. This decision was to prove costly. The Red Army, after liberating concentration camps throughout Poland, soon took political control of all the major Polish cities and towns, including Gdansk itself, where Jenny was trying to hide. The records of who had been soldiers and guards inside the concentration camps soon fell into the hands of Soviet officials, who began to search the length and breadth of Poland one by one. Russian soldiers under Stalin's order did not intend to let a single Nazi war criminal go unpunished. It was not only an order from the High Command, but also a patriotic feeling that overlay them. Russians liberating the concentration camps often met relatives, friends, or former comrades who had been imprisoned. They wanted to search for those guilty of the crimes that had been committed against their loved ones and compatriots. They wanted to capture those responsible in any way they could. Not only the ideologues, but also the perpetrators themselves, such as Jenny. It was for this reason that, once they had the names, surnames, and portraits of the people who worked in these camps, they began to print ads in newspapers and on the streets. It was for this reason that as Jenny walked to the Gdansk train station, she saw her face on banners that read, "Wanted as a criminal." Local people watched her. She tried to hide as best she could. Finally, an anonymous Pole denounced her to the Russians. It was only a matter of time before she would be captured. The Soviets made intelligence on her movements, studied every step Jenny took or might take, until they finally pounced on her at the Gdansk train station, just as she was trying to flee Poland. She had bought a train ticket to impunity, but in the end, all she found was justice. No remorse in Nazi model trial. At the beginning of 1946, the Stutthof trials began. These trials lasted throughout 1946 and 1947. There were a total of 4 different that sought to bring justice to those bloodthirsty murderers who committed horrible crimes against humanity in this gloomy concentration camp where Jenny used to work. In the early days of 1946, Commandant Johann Pauls, 5 male capos and 5 female guards, including the Nazi model, took the stand to hear the accusations against them. During the interrogations, Jenny-Wanda Barkmann denied all the accusations against her with the best of smiles. In fact, she even dared to lie. She said that she had treated Jewish women and children well and had even saved many from death in the gas chamber. Throughout the trial, this beautiful specter did not seem at all concerned about her fate. In fact, she even flirted with her guards and tried to seduce them to have sex with them and get some favors like better food and bedding. Jenny did not seem at all worried about the fate that awaited her. Perhaps in her unconscious, she thought that her divine mission in favor of the Führer was already completed, or maybe it no longer made sense to continue fighting with the physical disappearance of her beloved leader. This Nazi princess took care of her appearance until her last days. She was shown very concerned about her hairstyle and clothing throughout the trial. Even while the accusations against her were being read, she was combing her hair and even smiling. If there was one thing Barkmann displayed during his trial, it was behavior bordering on schizophrenia. At first, he denied that he had enlisted in the SS on his own initiative. Jenny said that her family was threatened by the Gestapo for helping politically persecuted people, and that she was recruited forcibly and under threat. When her accusers quickly dismissed this statement, Jenny changed her statement the next day. She admitted that she had actually responded to Goebbels' call when she heard about it in a newspaper, but in fact she did so because she preferred to be the one to take care of these poor Jewish victims and not some other even more brutal woman. The Polish court soon dismissed this statement when presented with the overwhelming evidence and testimony against her. It was at that moment that Jenny finally accepted her fate. The perfect Nazi doll realized that there was no longer any chance of getting out of that trial alive. So she began to proudly admit one after another the crimes she had committed against children, women, and men, whom she still considered racially inferior. Brutal but fair execution of the Nazi model. As she expected, Jenny-Wanda Barkmann was found guilty along with the rest who were on trial with her. As she heard her sentence, she was still fussing over her hairstyle and smiling. Witnesses claim that she stated that life was really a pleasure, and pleasures were usually brief. On July 4, 1946, the 11 sentenced prisoners were transported to a small hill in Gdansk, known as Biskupia Gorka in English Bishop's Hill. There, 4 double T-shaped gallows were erected, centered around a triple gallows. The 11 were hung on the back of military trucks that drove away to be strangled to death with a short drop gallows. The first of the 11 condemned to accept her fate was the aspiring Nazi model herself. No more smiles or angelic looks on her face. Her countenance was icy, empty, and almost lifeless. She stood in front of nearly 200,000 Poles who were waiting to see this fearsome Nazi guard who had committed so many crimes against her countrymen pay for what she had done with her own life. The crowd was ecstatic, clapping and cheering. They wanted revenge, and they were right. It is said that there was such a thirst for justice that some former Stutthof prisoners volunteered to be executioners. One of them placed the noose around Barkmann's neck and the truck stopped. A woman in the crowd ran up to the merciless guard and pushed his legs out of the truck. The driver finally started the march and Barkmann was hanged to death. The 200,000 people in attendance applauded fervently and chanted, The young Nazi model was only 24 years old when her body lay lifeless in front of those she had tortured and mutilated. Stutthof was one of the last public executions in Poland. The political authorities decided to stop such events because the crowds were overflowing with passion and thirst for revenge against these Nazi beasts. From the very day of her death, rumors began to spread about the fate of her body. Many Gdansk residents claimed that she had been cremated and her ashes thrown into a toilet. The truth is that this did not happen. The political authorities in Poland decided that her body should be sent to the Department of Anatomy and Neurobiology at the Medical Academy in Gdansk. In this institution, his body was used for scientific and medical experiments over several months. History had come back in boomerang form for Jenny. Justice had finally been done. Jenny-Wanda Barkmann, better known as the beautiful specter to both her comrades and her prisoners, was one of the most brutal Nazi criminals to pass through the concentration camps. She worked in one of the most brutal places, the Stutthof camp in Poland. Jenny was noted as much for her ferocity and sadism as for her captivating beauty, and had been just a child when Hitler had come to power. Nothing would have suggested in 1933 that this little girl would become one of the most heinous and brutal SS guards. Goebbels' propaganda had entered her eyes and her veins until it infected her with the virus of intolerance and sadism. Late in 1944, she decided to enlist, and only 1 year was enough for her to murder and torture for pleasure in Stutthof. Sooner or later, justice comes, and it came for Jenny. Those family and friends and the concentration camp prisoners themselves attended her execution, applauded and enjoyed it. In the end, the young woman from Hamburg who wanted to be a model never became one. Her life ended at the age of 24. It was justice.